The dawn in the Ever-Sigh Valley did not break with a shout of light, but with a slow amber seep that turned the morning mist into the color of clover honey. In this valley, the trees did not just grow, they remembered. Mallow lived in a dwelling carved into a limestone shelf, tucked safely behind a curtain of weeping willow branches. He was a gnome of considerable years, possessing a beard that reached his knees, and was often adorned with small, stray bits of dried lavender or pencil shavings. His home was a sanctuary of quiet. The only sounds were the soft tick-tick of a copper kettle and the scratching of his charcoal stick against vellum. Gnomes are a people of the earth, but Mallow was a gnome of the record. While others spent their days gathering dew or tending to mushroom patches, Mallow spent his time listening to the wood. On this particular morning, Mallow sat at his heavy oak desk, a desk that was actually the stump of a tree that had volunteered to hold his books centuries ago. He was preparing for the unlocking. Every year when the first frost kissed the valley, the trees entered a state of deep honesty. Their bark would soften slightly, and the memories stored within their grain would rise to the surface, ready to be read. He adjusted his spectacles, which were framed in polished beetle shell, and looked out at the valley. "A quiet day for a long memory," he whispered to his companion, a flightless bumblebee named Barnaby, who lived in a cozy felted hat near the hearth. Barnaby let out a low, vibrating hum of agreement. Mallow reached for his reading glass. This was no ordinary lens. It was a slice of compressed time, a crystal found in the deepest roots of the mountains that allowed the viewer to see the world not as it is, but as it was. Today, Mallow had a specific task. A great silver fir had fallen in the northern glade during the late autumn gales. A tree of that size carried 300 years of history. It would have seen the Great Drought, the year of the blue butterflies, and perhaps even the passing of the moon stag. It was Mallow's duty to ensure these stories were not lost to the soil as the tree decayed. He packed his satchel with care. He took his translation balm, a mixture of resin and peppermint, his charcoal rolls, and a small thermos of elderberry tea. As he stepped out of his willow-curtained door, the air hit him, crisp, cool, and smelling of damp earth and slumbering sap. He didn't walk with haste. Gnomes know that the faster you move, the more the forest hides from you. He walked with the snail's pace, a meditative stride where each footfall is a conversation with the ground. As he walked, he noticed the small details that others might miss. The way the frost had patterned itself onto a fallen maple leaf like a map of a distant star system. The way the squirrels were tucking their acorns not just into holes, but into specific mossy crevices that would keep them dry during the deep freeze. By the time Mallow reached the northern glade, the sun was high enough to turn the frost into 1,000 tiny diamonds. And there lay the silver fir. It was a giant, even in death, its trunk draped in a velvet cloak of emerald moss. Mallow approached the fallen titan with a bow. "Greetings, elder," he said softly. "I have come to listen." He knelt by the exposed rings of the stump. To a human, they were just circles. To Mallow, they were the grooves of a record player, waiting for the needle. He applied a small dab of the translation balm to his fingertips and touched the outermost ring, the year that had just passed. Immediately, a sensation of cold wind and the sound of cracking ice filled his mind. He closed his eyes, and the reading began. The translation of a tree's rings is a delicate business. It is not like reading words on a page. It is more like catching the scent of a dream just as you wake up. Mallow sat cross-legged on a cushion of dry pine needles, his hands resting lightly on the weathered wood of the silver fir. Through the translation balm, the sensations began to flow. He felt the weight of the heavy snows from 3 winters ago, a dull, quiet pressure that made his own shoulders ache in sympathy. He felt the tickle of a family of woodpeckers that had nested in the western hollow during a particularly buggy summer. But as Mallow moved his fingers deeper toward the center of the trunk, traveling back nearly 100 years, the flavor of the memory changed. The wood here felt damp, even though the day was dry. It vibrated with a low, subterranean frequency. Mallow adjusted his beetle shell spectacles and brought his reading glass to his eye. Through the crystal lens, the growth rings began to glow with a faint, bioluminescent blue. "Barnaby," Mallow whispered, "look at the spacing here." The bumblebee crawled out of Mallow's pocket and buzzed softly. In this section of the wood, the rings were unusually wide, suggesting a period of incredible lush growth. But it wasn't the growth of a rainy season. The rings were sweetwater rings, narrow on the outside and porous in the middle. "This tree wasn't drinking from the clouds," Mallow murmured, his charcoal stick flying across his vellum scroll. "It was drinking from the Vein of Echoes." The Vein of Echoes was a legendary underground river, said to be as clear as liquid diamond and as cold as the stars. Gnomes spoke of it in hushed tones, for it was believed that the river didn't just carry water, it carried the songs of the earth. But the river had been lost to the maps for generations. Most gnomes believed it had dried up or retreated into the lightless belly of the mountains. Mallow pressed his ear against the wood. Because the silver fir had died, its internal straws, the xylem and phloem, were empty, acting like long, hollow pipes. And then he heard it. It wasn't a sound of rushing water. It was a faint, melodic whistling. Fipple-pip-low. It was the sound of air being pushed through a distant stone throat. "The river hasn't vanished," Mallow realized, his heart giving a small, excited flutter. "It has gone airbound. It's flowing through the caverns beneath us, but it's thirsty." He looked at the rings again. The tree's record showed that 80 years ago, the water had suddenly shifted. The rings became tight and strained. The fir had spent the last several decades of its life reaching deeper and deeper with its taproot, trying to follow the receding music. Mallow stood up, brushing the pine needles from his trousers. If the Vein of Echoes was moving, the entire balance of the Ever-Sigh Valley was at risk. The singing willows would lose their voices, and the crystal moss would turn to gray dust. He needed to find where the river had turned. He pulled out a small brass instrument called a dowsing chime. It looked like a tiny bell with 3 clappers. He held it suspended by a silk thread. Normally, a bell rings when struck, but a dowsing chime only rings when it is perfectly level over a source of active silence, the void created by flowing water. He began to walk north, toward the Standerstones, a circle of ancient, moss-covered rocks that marked the highest point of the valley. The walk was slow. Every few steps, Mallow would stop, wait for the chime to settle, and listen. The valley was waking up. He passed a group of thimblehares grooming themselves in the sun. They paused to watch the old gnome, their long ears twitching in sync with his bell. As he climbed the slope, the air grew colder, and the scent of old ice began to override the scent of the pine. It was a sharp, mineral smell, like a wet stone in a cellar. Suddenly, the dowsing chime didn't just sway. It let out a single, clear note. Ting! Mallow stopped. He wasn't standing near a stream or a pond. He was standing in front of a small, unremarkable hole in the ground, hidden beneath the roots of a twisted hawthorn tree. The hole was no wider than a gnome's waist, but the air coming out of it was moving. It smelled of ancient minerals and something else, something sweet, like wild honeysuckle. "The breath of the river," Mallow whispered. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, glowing marble of foxfire glass. He dropped it into the hole. He watched the green light tumble down, bouncing off smooth, water-worn walls, deeper and deeper, until it hit a ledge far below. The light revealed a passage. But it wasn't a natural cave. The walls were etched with the same swirling patterns Mallow had seen in the silver fur's rings. "Barnaby," Mallow said, checking the straps of his bag, "I believe we are going to have to do more than just read history today. I think we are going to have to walk through it." The descent into the flute caverns was not a climb, but a slow, rhythmic sliding. Mallow used his sturdy walking stick, made of seasoned blackthorn, to brace against the smooth, damp walls of the shaft. The air here was vibrant. It didn't just sit in the lungs, it hummed against the ribs. As he reached the bottom of the shaft, Mallow stepped onto a floor of fine white sand that looked like crushed pearls. He raised his foxfire glass, and the cavern blossomed into light. It was a cathedral of stone. Thousands of stalactites hung from the ceiling, but they weren't jagged or sharp. They were shaped like long, elegant flutes, polished to a mirror shine by centuries of moisture. The wind from the surface, filtered through the narrow cracks above, moved through these stone pipes, creating a low, droning chord that sounded like a sleeping giant's breath. "The resonance is off," Mallow murmured, tilting his head. Being a bark reader meant he understood harmony. A healthy forest had a song line that connected the roots to the wind. But here, the music of the caverns was fractured. One of the deep notes was missing, replaced by a soft, rhythmic thump-thump that sounded like a drum wrapped in velvet. He followed the sound, his boots leaving silent imprints in the pearly sand. As he rounded a bend where the walls sparkled with star mica, he saw the river. The vein of echoes was breathtaking. It didn't flow like a muddy creek. It was a ribbon of liquid sapphire, glowing with its own inner light. It moved with such speed and silence that it looked like a solid piece of glass. But it wasn't flowing freely. A massive obstruction sat in the center of the riverbed. At first, Mallow thought it was a boulder. But as he drew closer, he realized it was a deep moss heart. It was a creature of the primordial dark, a globe of thick, bioluminescent moss the size of a wagon. It had settled into the narrowest part of the channel, its thousands of tiny tendrils drinking thirstily from the sapphire water. The thump-thump sound was the heart of the moss, pulsing as it absorbed the river's melody. "Oh, you poor, hungry thing," Mallow sighed. The deep moss heart wasn't evil. It was simply misplaced. These creatures usually lived in the sighing sinks, much deeper in the earth, where the water was stagnant and rich in minerals. This one had floated up during a shift in the plates and found the vein of echoes. Like a sponge in a pipe, it was soaking up the water and the sound, hushing the valley above. If Mallow used his trowel to cut the moss away, the shock would kill the creature and likely poison the river with its bitter spores. He had to move it, but a gnome of his size couldn't lift a deep moss heart, even with 10 of his strongest neighbors. "Barnaby," Mallow said, sitting down on a dry ledge and opening his thermos of elderberry tea. "We need a dissuasion scent." He reached into his bag and pulled out a jar labeled dried sunlight and summer dust. Deep moss lived for the damp, the dark, and the cool. To it, the scent of a hot July afternoon was as repellent as smoke is to a bee. But he couldn't just throw the jar at it. He had to be precise. Mallow took a long, hollow reed from his bag, one he usually used for blowing dust off old vellum, and carefully packed it with the dried sunlight powder. He approached the edge of the river, feeling the spray of the sapphire water on his face. The moss heart pulsed, a wave of deep violet light rippling through its emerald body. It felt Mallow's presence. A few tendrils drifted toward him, searching for warmth. "Hold your breath, Barnaby," Mallow whispered. He aimed the reed at the root anchor. the spot where the moss had gripped the stone floor beneath the water. With a sharp puff, he blew the powder into the current. The effect was instantaneous. As the scent of summer hit the moss, the creature let out a high-pitched, harmonic shiver. It didn't like the dryness of the smell. It began to pull its tendrils back, shrinking away from the invisible heat. But it was stubborn. It had tasted the sapphire water, and it didn't want to leave. Mallow realized he needed to give it somewhere to go. He looked downriver and saw a side channel, a dark, quiet pool where the water moved slowly and the silt was thick. It was the perfect home for a moss heart. He reached for another jar. Decayed willow and deep shadow. This was the home scent. He threw the second jar into the side channel, where it shattered against the rocks, releasing a thick, earthy aroma that smelled of ancient, peaceful basements. The moss heart's pulses changed from violet to a soft, curious blue. It began to walk, a slow, rolling motion as it untangled itself from the main river and drifted toward the side pool, lured by the scent of the dark. With a final, gargling slurp, the river was clear. The vein of echoes let out a triumphant roar. The sound hit the stone flutes on the ceiling, and suddenly the cavern was filled with a blindingly beautiful chord of perfect C major. Up in the valley, the trees would feel it. The silver fir's record would finally be complete. But as the water rushed past, Mallow noticed something caught in the eddies where the moss heart had been sitting. It was an object that shouldn't be in an underground river. It was a silver locket, shaped like an acorn, and it was vibrating in harmony with the river's song. The silver locket felt unnaturally warm in Mallow's palm, a stark contrast to the icy spray of the sapphire river. It was etched with microscopic runes that didn't follow the patterns of the earth or the trees. These were aloft script, the swirling, airy calligraphy used by those who lived above the canopy. "Barnaby," Mallow murmured, his thumb tracing the acorn's cap. "This belongs to the cloud weavers." The cloud weavers were a rare branch of gnome kind who lived in suspended dwellings woven from living willow and anchored to the highest peaks of the Sighing Mountains. They were the keepers of the weather, responsible for guiding the rain clouds and ensuring the valley received its fair share of mist. But during the Great Drought 80 years ago, their leader, a weaver named Aria, had vanished. The clouds had grown erratic and thin ever since. With a gentle click of his fingernail, Mallow pressed the spring. The locket didn't just pop open, it unfolded like a blooming flower. Inside was no photograph or lock of hair. Instead, there was a tiny, captured echo cloud, a swirl of white vapor that hummed with a soft, mournful tone. As the air of the cavern hit it, the vapor began to expand, projecting a faint, shimmering image against the limestone wall. It was a map, but a map of the sky. It showed the invisible wind roads that spanned the valley. One of the roads, the main artery that brought the spring rains, was severed, tied off in a knot that looked suspiciously like the work of the shadowloom thistle had once faced in the legends. She didn't get lost, Mallow realized, his brow furrowed behind his spectacles. She was trying to anchor the river to the rain. She knew the vein of echoes was receding, and she tried to stitch the earth to the sky to save us. The locket began to vibrate more intensely. The echo cloud within it started to pulse in time with the stone flutes on the ceiling. Fipple, pip, low. The music of the caverns was no longer just a beautiful sound. It was a set of instructions. Mallow looked at his vellum scroll. The sweet water rings he had read in the silver fir weren't just a record of growth. They were a rhythm. "If I can play the flute caverns," Mallow whispered, a bold idea taking root in his mind, "I can send a signal through the wind cracks. I can tell the clouds where the water is." He stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. He wasn't a musician, but he was a reader, and he knew how to find the stress points in a sequence. He moved to the center of the hall, where 3 massive stalactites, each the size of a cathedral organ pipe, hung just inches above the rushing sapphire water. These were the master flutes. He reached into his bag and pulled out his resonance mallet, a tool usually used for testing the hollowness of old logs. "Barnaby, I need you to fly to the upper vents," Mallow instructed. "When you feel the air start to pull upward, hum as loud as you can. We need to create a vacuum." The bumblebee let out a brave buzz and spiraled up into the dark, disappearing into the narrow fissures in the ceiling. Mallow took a deep breath. He looked at the silver locket, using it as a conductor's baton. He struck the first master flute. Bong! A deep, tectonic note rolled through the cavern, shaking the pearly sand. He struck the second. Chime! A high, crystalline sound that made the star mica on the walls flare with light. He waited. He felt the river surge, its sapphire glow brightening as it responded to the vibration. The air began to whistle. From far above, he heard the tiny, vibrating hum of Barnaby. Mallow struck the third flute and held his mallet against the stone, letting the vibration travel through his own arms. The 3 notes merged into a chord of invitation. The sound didn't stay in the cavern. It was funneled through the stone pipes, gathering speed and pressure until it shot out of the hawthorn root hole on the surface like a geyser of pure music. High above the Ever-Sigh Valley, the thin, ragged clouds heard the call. They began to swirl, drawn by the harmonic thirst Mallow had created. The knot in the wind road began to fray, but the effort was immense. The cavern began to groan. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the sapphire river started to froth. Mallow's legs trembled, but he didn't stop. He was reading the music of the locket, playing the song of a gnome he had never met, to save a valley that had forgotten how to dream of rain. Suddenly, a brilliant beam of moonlight pierced through the ceiling vents, striking the silver locket. The echo cloud inside it leaped out, turning into a majestic, translucent swan made of mist. The swan circled Mallow once, then flew straight up into the rock, passing through the stone as if it were water. A moment later, the first drop of rain in months hit the pearly sand of the cavern floor. The ascent back to the surface was marked by a sound Mallow hadn't heard in nearly a century, the rhythmic, percussive patter-tap of raindrops hitting the dry leaves above. By the time he crawled out from beneath the hawthorn tree, the Ever-Sigh Valley had been transformed into a theater of silver and shadow. The rain was not a storm, but a nursing rain, gentle, warm, and smelling of ozone and wet slate. As each drop touched the ground, the parched earth seemed to let out a collective sigh. The crystal moss, which had been gray and brittle, began to swell, turning a deep, vibrant turquoise that glowed softly in the twilight. Mallow stood in the center of the stander stones, his hat soaked through and his beard dripping. But he felt a lightness in his chest that no amount of damp could dampen. Barnaby landed. On his shoulder, his fuzzy wings vibrating with excitement as he cleaned the cave dust from his antennae. "Look, Barnaby," Mallow whispered, pointing toward the mountains. The cloud weaver's invisible roads were no longer invisible. The rain, falling through the moonlight, revealed the shimmering, silken threads that Arya had woven so long ago. They stretched across the sky like the strings of a giant harp, vibrating as the wind passed through them. The knot had been untied. The sky and the earth were speaking to one another again. Mallow looked down at the silver locket in his hand. The echo cloud was gone, but the metal was still pulsing with a faint, rhythmic heat. There was one petal of the acorn design that hadn't unfolded. He sat down on one of the flat stander stones, uncorked his thermos of now lukewarm elderberry tea, and took a slow, thoughtful sip. He felt the history of the valley flowing around him, not as a series of stagnant rings in a tree, but as a living, breathing river of time. He pressed the final pedal. Instead of a map or a cloud, a voice drifted out of the locket. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears, but a vibration felt in the marrow of his bones. It was Arya, the Cloud Weaver. "To the one who listens," the voice chimed, sounding like wind through willow leaves. "If you are hearing this, the resonance has been restored. I did not fall, and I did not flee. I became the anchor. When the drought threatened to snap the threads, I gave my own song to the vein of echoes to keep the music alive until a reader could find it." Mallow's eyes widened. He looked toward the northern glade where the silver fir lay. He realized now why that specific tree had been so resilient, why its rings had carried the sweet water for so long. Arya hadn't vanished. She had merged her spirit with the river and the roots, becoming the very harmony he had just played. The locket let out a final soft ping and dissolved in his hand. It didn't break. It turned into a handful of shimmering silver seeds. "She isn't gone, Barnaby," Mallow said, his voice thick with wonder. "She was just waiting for someone to finish the sentence she started." He stood up and walked back toward the fallen silver fir. The rain was steady now, soaking deep into the bark. Mallow knelt at the base of the massive trunk. Using his silver trowel, he dug a small, neat hole in the rich, wet soil, right where the tree's heart had once beat. He planted the silver seeds. As the earth covered them, a surge of warmth traveled through the ground. The silver fir didn't stand back up, but its moss began to grow with impossible speed, weaving a protective bower over the site. In the years to come, Mallow knew, a new kind of tree would grow here, a harmony oak, whose leaves would whistle in the wind and whose roots would never go thirsty. Mallow turned back toward his willow-curtained home. The valley was safe. The archive of whispering bark would have a new, glorious chapter to record tonight. As he walked the snail's pace back to his hearth, he felt the rhythm of the rain, the pulse of the river, and the vibration of the trees all humming the same tune. It was a song of balance, of a gnome who read the past and a weaver who secured the future. He reached his door, hung up his wet hat, and sat at his desk. He took a fresh vellum scroll and dipped his charcoal stick into a pot of ink made from crushed walnuts. "In the year of the returning rain," he wrote, his handwriting steady and neat. "The earth found its voice again, and it was a voice worth listening to." Barnaby curled up in his felted hat. The kettle began to whistle, and Mallow, the elder bark reader, finally let out a long, happy sigh. The season of the deep hush arrived with a blanket of snow that felt less like cold and more like a heavy, white velvet. In the Ever-Sigh Valley, winter was not a time of death, but a time of internal listening. For Mallow, it meant the archive was at its busiest. When the sap moved slowly, the stories became thick and concentrated. He was in the middle of cataloging the frost fables, tiny crystalline structures that formed on the inside of his windows, when a sound disturbed the silence of his study. It wasn't the rhythmic thump of falling snow or the crackle of his hearth. It was a sharp, rhythmic clinking, like metal striking stone. Barnaby the bee lifted his head from his felted hat, his antennae twitching with suspicion. Mallow moved to his door and pushed aside the frozen willow curtain. Standing in the snow was a young gnome, perhaps no older than 40, a mere sprout by gnome standards, but he didn't look like any gnome Mallow had ever seen. Instead of a hat made of felt or bark, he wore a cap of stitched copper wire. His vest was made of heavy, oil-stained canvas, and strapped to his back was a satchel that hummed with a low, electric vibration. "Elder Mallow?" the young gnome asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes were wide with a mix of exhaustion and awe. "I am Piston. I've come from the Bloom Towers of the north, what used to be the Iron City." Mallow lowered his spectacles. "The Iron City? That is a long walk for a pair of metal-soled boots, young Piston." "I didn't walk the whole way," Piston said, patting his satchel. "I followed the vibration path. Since the Great Bloom, the iron in our city has started to speak. But we don't know the words. My people know how to build, and we know how to fix, but we have forgotten how to listen to something that grows." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic object. It was a gear, but it was made of living wood that had hardened into a brass-like density. The teeth of the gear were shaped like tiny oak leaves. "It grew out of our main water pump," Piston explained. "It works perfectly, but every time it turns it makes a sound like a sad flute. No one in the city can tell us why the machine is crying." Mallow felt a familiar tingle in his fingertips, the itch of a story waiting to be unraveled. He stepped back and gestured for the lad to enter. "Come in, Piston. The tea is elderberry, and the fire is oak. Set your bag down. The metal in this room is making my books nervous." Piston entered, looking around the sanctuary of bark and vellum with wide-eyed wonder. He moved carefully, as if afraid that his heavy boots might bruise the floor. He sat on the edge of a driftwood chair, clutching his wooden gear. "You are a bark reader," Piston said softly. "In the city, they say you can hear a tree's heartbeat from 3 valleys away." "The city exaggerates," Mallow smiled, pouring a steaming mug of tea. "I simply pay attention to what most people step over. Now, let me see that gear." Mallow took the object. It was warm, unnaturally so. He brought his reading glass to his eye and peered into the grain of the wood-metal hybrid. He didn't see the usual rings of a tree. Instead, he saw a complex network of signal lines that looked like a map of a nervous system. The sad flute sound Piston described wasn't a malfunction. It was a morning song. "This gear didn't grow from your pump," Mallow said, his voice turning grave. "It's trying to replace it. Your city is blooming, yes, but the earth beneath it is still remembering the weight of the iron. This gear is a bridge. It's trying to tell the machines that they don't need to fight the roots anymore." "How do we help it?" Piston asked. "The city is frightened. They think the forest is eating the machines." "The forest isn't eating them," Mallow corrected. "It's inviting them to dinner. But for the invitation to be accepted, the machines must learn to pulse, not just pound." Mallow stood up and walked to his deep shelf, where he kept the most ancient records. He pulled out a scroll that was so old it felt like dried skin. "Piston, you have come at the right time. The season of the deep hush is when the transition is easiest. I cannot go to your city. My roots are too deep in this valley. But I can teach you the language of the pulse." He laid the scroll out. It wasn't covered in writing, but in touch marks, raised bumps that represented different vibrations of the earth. "For the next 7 days," Mallow said, "you will leave your copper hat at the door. You will wear moss in your boots, and you will learn to read the rings of a tree using nothing but your heartbeat. If you want to fix the crying pump, you must first understand why the water is singing." Piston looked at his grease-stained hands, then at the ancient, glowing scroll. For the first time since he had arrived, the hum in his satchel slowed down, syncing perfectly with the crackle of Mallow's fire. The apprentice had arrived, and the archive was about to get a lot louder. The training of a city gnome was a slow, quiet labor. For 3 days, Mallow made Piston sit in the center of the study with a blindfold made of spider silk. He was not allowed to speak. He was only allowed to feel the vibrations of the room. He had to distinguish between the soft tock of the grandfather clock and the rhythmic breathing of the great cedar that housed Mallow's archive. On the fourth morning, the snow stopped, and a pale, pearlescent sun hung over the whispering grove. "Today," Mallow announced, wrapping himself in a heavy wool cloak, "we visit the Harmony Oak. It is time you heard a song that wasn't made by a gear." They walked into the woods. Piston moved awkwardly, his heavy canvas vest crinkling loudly in the frost-nipped air. He kept reaching for the brass tools in his pockets, out of habit. "Leave the metal alone, lad," Mallow chided gently. "Your tools are for fixing things that are broken. The forest isn't broken. It's just speaking a dialect you haven't mastered yet." They reached the northern glade. In the center, where Mallow had planted the silver seeds months ago, stood the Harmony Oak. It was a strange and beautiful sight. The tree was still young, but its bark was not rough. It was smooth and shimmering, like polished pewter. Its leaves didn't drop for winter. They curled into silver bells that caught the light. As the wind moved through the glade, the tree began to play. It wasn't a random rustling. It was a complex, layered melody, a mixture of the sapphire river's roar and the soft, airy hum of the cloud weavers. Piston gasped, his hands dropping to his sides. It sounds like a clockwork music box, but without the ticking." "That," Mallow said, "is the steady pulse. It is the rhythm of growth. Your crying pump in the city is trying to match this sound, but it's fighting the friction of its own rust." Mallow knelt by the roots of the tree and gestured for Piston to do the same. He took the young gnome's hand and pressed it against the pewter bark. "Don't listen with your ears," Mallow instructed. "Listen with your fingertips. Feel the sap moving. It doesn't move in a straight line, like steam in a pipe. It moves in a spiral. It yields to the curves of the wood." Piston closed his eyes. At first he felt nothing but the cold. Then he felt a faint thrum. It was deep, resonant, and incredibly patient. It was the sound of a living thing that was willing to wait 100 years just to reach a single ray of sunlight. Suddenly, Piston's own satchel, the one containing his metallic tools, began to vibrate in sympathy. The wooden metal gear he had brought from the city started to glow with a soft amber light. It's answering," Piston whispered, his eyes snapping open. "The gear isn't crying because it's sad. It's crying because it's lonely. It's trying to find the rest of the song." Mallow nodded, his eyes twinkling. "In your city, you build things to last by making them hard. But in the forest, things last by being flexible. To fix your city, you don't need more grease or better steel. You need to teach your machines how to pulse with the seasons. When it is winter, the pumps should sleep. When it is spring, they should dance." Piston looked at the Harmony Oak, then back at his grease-stained hands. He realized that his people had spent centuries trying to conquer the earth with iron, only to find that the earth was more than happy to share its power, if only they asked in the right key. "I need to go back," Piston said, his voice filled with a new, quiet urgency. "I need to show the artificers. We don't have to fear the roots. We can weave them into the foundations." "Not yet," Mallow said, standing up and dusting the snow from his knees. "You have the melody, but you don't have the anchor note. For that, we must go to the frozen falls, where the water turns to glass. You must learn how to hold a song still without breaking it." As they walked away from the glade, the Harmony Oak let out a final, shimmering chord that seemed to follow them like a blessing. Piston didn't reach for his tools once during the walk back. He walked with the snail's pace, his eyes open to the patterns in the frost, his heart finally beginning to sink with the slow, deep breath of the valley. The journey to the frozen falls took them to the highest lip of the valley, where the air grew so thin and cold it felt like inhaling needles of mint. Here, the exuberant songs of the forest were muffled by a heavy, crystalline silence. The waterfall, which in summer was a thundering curtain of spray, was now a jagged, motionless sculpture of blue ice, a moment of gravity caught and frozen in mid-air. "This is the Hall of the Ice Hush," Mallow whispered, his breath billowing out in a thick white cloud. "The water is still moving, Piston, but it is moving deep inside, where the cold cannot reach." Piston shivered, his copper wire cap frosting over. "It feels like the world has stopped breathing." "Not stopped," Mallow corrected. "Stored. This is where the earth keeps its secrets until the sun is strong enough to handle them." They approached the base of the falls. The ice was translucent, and through its layers they could see dark shapes, stones, ancient logs, and perhaps even the fossils of flowers trapped in the frozen amber of winter. Suddenly, a low, tectonic vibration hummed through the soles of their boots. From behind the curtain of ice, a figure emerged. It was the Winter Guardian. He was a gnome of immense size, nearly double the height of Mallow, and his skin was the color of a storm cloud. His beard was not hair, but a cascading fall of icicles that chimed together like a glass harp. The Guardian's eyes were two pale moons, unblinking and ancient. He looked at Piston's metal canvas vest and let out a sound like a glacier calving. "The smell of the forge," the Guardian rumbled, "the clatter of the piston. Why does the child of iron disturb the deep hush?" Piston stepped forward, his legs trembling. He didn't reach for his tools. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out the wood-metal gear. He held it out in his open palms, not as a weapon, but as an offering. "I am Piston of the Bloom Towers," he said, his voice cracking but firm. "I come because our iron is crying. I come because we want to learn how to be still." The Guardian leaned down, his icicle beard clinking against the frozen ground. He sniffed the gear. "It is a hybrid, a confused heart. It wants to turn, but it does not know the reason for the circle." The Guardian turned his gaze to Mallow. "You bring a heavy burden to my falls, Bark Reader." "He is a bridge, Guardian," Mallow said. "The Iron City is no longer a wound. It is trying to become a graft. But it needs the anchor note. It needs to know how to hold its strength without crushing the soft things." The Winter Guardian stood tall and struck the frozen waterfall with a staff made of solid, unmelting sleet. A sound erupted. A single, low frequency so powerful it seemed to vibrate the very marrow of their bones. It was the anchor note, the frequency of the Earth's rotation, the sound of mountains standing still. "To hold a song still," the Guardian said, looking at Piston, "you must realize that stillness is just motion so fast it looks like rest. Your machines are frantic because they fear the stop. Teach them that the stop is where the strength is gathered." The Guardian reached out a massive, frost-covered finger and touched the wooden gear in Piston's hand. A spark of blue-white light jumped from the ice to the gear. The wood didn't freeze, it hardened, the grain turning into a pattern of frost flowers that would never melt. The gear stopped vibrating. It didn't hum, and it didn't cry. It simply sat in Piston's hand, feeling as heavy and as permanent as a mountain. "The anchor is set," the Guardian declared. "Now go. The spring is already dreaming in the roots, and your city must be ready to wake up without breaking." With a swirl of snow, the Guardian vanished back into the ice. Piston looked at the gear. It was no longer a piece of a machine. It was a compass. He felt the weight of it, the incredible, peaceful stability of the ice. He looked at Mallow, his eyes wet with tears that immediately froze into tiny pearls on his cheeks. "I understand now," Piston said. "The machines don't need to be faster. They need to be more certain." Mallow smiled, his own beard white with rime. "Then you have graduated, young Piston. The bark reader has nothing more to teach the smith. You have the melody from the oak and the anchor from the ice." As they began the long walk back down the mountain, the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of violet and rose. The valley was silent, but it was a silence full of potential, the deep hush of a world getting ready to bloom in a way it never had before. The journey back to the Ever-Sigh Valley was swifter than the climb. Piston walked with a new gait, one that didn't fight the slope, but flowed with it. When they reached the edge of the valley, where the trees began to thin and the smell of ozone and hot metal drifted on the wind, Piston stopped. "This is where I must leave the path of the bark," Piston said, looking toward the distant, shimmering silhouettes of the bloom towers. The city was no longer a dark smudge on the horizon. It looked like a cluster of giant copper lilies. Mallow placed a weathered hand on the young gnome's shoulder. "Remember, Piston, a machine is just a tree made of different materials. If you treat it with the same respect you give the roots, it will never fail you." Piston nodded, adjusted his satchel, which no longer rattled, but emitted a steady, comforting warmth, and set off toward the north. Mallow didn't go back to his study immediately. He climbed the high ridge, a limestone shelf that offered a clear view of the city's heart. He sat on a stump, Barnaby buzzing contentedly in the folds of his cloak, and waited for the moon to rise. In the distance, the Iron City was preparing for the great tuning. Through his reading glass, Mallow could see the frantic activity on the towers. The artificers were gathered around the crying pump, their brass tools glinting in the moonlight. He saw Piston climb to the central platform. The young gnome didn't pull out a wrench or a hammer. He stood before the massive, shuddering machine and pulled out the frost-hardened gear. The air grew still. Piston placed the gear into the heart of the pump. For a heartbeat, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. The metallic screeching, the hissing steam, and the rhythmic pounding that had defined the Iron City for centuries suddenly cut out. Silence. Then, a low, resonant note began to swell. It started at the base of the towers and moved upward. It wasn't the sound of a motor. It was the anchor note they had heard at the frozen falls. One by one, the other machines in the city caught the frequency. The gears didn't clatter, they glided. The pistons didn't slam, pulsed. The sound was a deep, harmonic drone that synced perfectly with the song of the harmony oak in the valley below. Mallow watched as the city began to breathe. The lights in the towers shifted from a harsh, flickering red to a steady, pulsing amber. The steam vents released clouds that smelled not of soot, but of fresh cedar and cool rain. The city and the forest were finally singing the same song. "He did it, Barnaby," Mallow whispered. "The iron has found its soul." As the night deepened, the resonance from the city traveled back through the ground, vibrating the very roots Mallow lived among. The trees in the valley seemed to lean toward the city, their branches swaying in time with the artificial pulse. The conflict between the built and the grown had been resolved into a single, beautiful symphony. Mallow stood up, his heart full. He walked back to his sanctuary behind the willow curtain. He sat at his desk and opened the archive of whispering bark. He turned to the very last page of the current volume. He didn't use charcoal this time. He took a small piece of the frosted metal Piston had left behind, a shaving of the anchor gear, and used it to etch the words directly into the vellum. "Today," he wrote, "the boundary between the forge and the forest was erased. We have learned that the pulse of life is the same, whether it flows through sap or through steam. The world is no longer divided. It is a single, great harmony. He closed the book. The kettle began to whistle, and for the first time in his long life, Mallow didn't feel like a keeper of the past. He felt like a witness to a new, everlasting beginning. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but the valley was warm with the vibration of a world that had finally learned how to listen. The season of the first bud arrived not with a thaw, but with a shimmer. As the heavy snows began to recede, they didn't leave behind mud and gray slush. Instead, the ground was carpeted in a fine, iridescent mist. In the Ever-Sigh Valley, the transition from winter to spring was always a sacred time. But this year, the air felt electric, humming with the residue of the great tuning. Mallow stood at the boundary where the northern woods met the outskirts of the Bloom Towers. This area, once a no-man's land of slag and stumps, was now the site of a miraculous transformation. "Do you smell that, Barnaby?" Mallow asked, his nose twitching. It wasn't just the scent of wet earth. It was a sharp, clean aroma, like peppermint and ozone, mixed with the deep, musky sweetness of ancient peat. In the softening soil, right where the underground iron pipes of the city crossed the deep taproots of the valley's maples, something new was emerging. They were small, tightly furled shoots that looked like they were made of spun copper, tipped with buds of translucent glass. Mallow knelt, his reading glass held steady. "They aren't just plants," he whispered. "They are copper lilies." As he watched, one of the buds began to unfurl. It didn't open like a petal. It clicked open like a delicate watch casing. Inside, instead of a stamen, was a tiny, vibrating wire of gold that captured the morning light and turned it into a soft, melodic chime. These were the children of the new harmony, species that had never existed before the city and the forest found their common pulse. They were living sensors, feeding on the minerals of the city and the nutrients of the woods. "Elder Mallow!" A familiar voice echoed across the ridge. Piston was coming toward him, no longer wearing his heavy canvas vest. He was dressed in soft green wool, though his boots were still reinforced with polished brass. Behind him trailed a group of young gnomes, some carrying gardening trowels and others carrying oil cans. "The lilies are blooming all the way to the central plaza," Piston shouted, his face beaming. "And look, the birds are back, but they aren't nesting in the eaves anymore. They're nesting in the ventilation shafts." "The city has become a lung," Mallow said, standing up to greet his apprentice. "It's no longer just drawing from the world. It's breathing back into it." Piston reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "I've been recording the frequencies of the copper lilies. Each one plays a different note, depending on the quality of the soil. We've started using them to monitor the health of the underground river. If the water grows cloudy, the lilies turn a dull bronze. If it's pure, they shine like new pennies." Mallow took the notebook, his fingers tracing the neat, precise sketches Piston had made. It was a new kind of archive, one that combined the data of a smith with the wisdom of a bark reader. "You've created a living laboratory, Piston," Mallow said proudly. "The archive of Whispering Bark will need a second volume just for your findings." As they walked together through the meadow of chiming lilies, Mallow noticed something peculiar. At the center of the largest cluster of flowers, the ground was vibrating with a rhythmic thump, thump, the exact heartbeat of the deep moss heart he had moved months ago. The river, the city, and the forest were now so intertwined that a change in one was felt by all. The hush of the winter had been replaced by a vibration of growth so unified it was almost silent. "What happens now, Elder?" Piston asked, looking out at the valley. "Now," Mallow said, tucking the notebook into his cloak, "we learn to live in the middle. Not gnomes of the cave, and not gnomes of the tower, but gnomes of the graft." He looked back at his willow-curtained home, then at the glowing spires of the city. For the first time, the distance between them didn't look like a gap to be bridged, but a garden to be tended. The season of the first bud was not destined to end in a gentle thaw. High above the Ever-Sigh Valley, where the invisible roads of the cloud weavers met the heat rising from the Bloom Towers, a new kind of weather was brewing. It was a storm of light, a phenomenon born from the friction between the forest's magical resonance and the city's electric pulse. The sky didn't turn black, it turned a bruised, shimmering violet. The clouds weren't heavy with water, but with static energy that made the hair on Mallow's neck stand on end. "The resonance is too high!" Mallow shouted over the rising hum. He and Piston stood in the center of the copper lily meadow. Around them, the glass-tipped buds were beginning to vibrate so violently they emitted a high-pitched scream. "The lilies are acting like lightning rods, Piston. If the sky breaks here, it will shatter the glass and burn the roots." Piston looked up at the sky, his brass-rimmed goggles reflecting the violet flashes. "The city's capacitors are full. We can't draw the energy away fast enough. We need a grounded anchor, something that can take the charge and feed it back into the earth without burning up." Mallow's eyes turned toward the northern glade. The Harmony Oak. The Harmony Oak, with its pewter bark and silver bell leaves, was more than just a tree. It was a biological conductor. Because it had been grown from silver seeds and nourished by the Sapphire River, it possessed a dampening soul. "Follow me," Mallow commanded, his old legs moving with surprising speed. They reached the glade just as the first bolt of violet lightning struck the ridge. The sound wasn't a crack of thunder, but a massive, resonant chime that shook the ground. The Harmony Oak was already glowing, its silver leaves spinning in the wind like tiny turbines. "We have to plug in the city," Piston yelled. He tore open his satchel and pulled out a long coil of spider silk wire, a conductive thread woven with copper and silk. He handed one end to Mallow. "Elder, you must find the main tap route. I have to connect the other end to the city's relay station on the ridge." Mallow knelt at the base of the oak. He didn't use a shovel. He used his hands, digging through the moss until he found the glowing, pewter-colored root that vibrated with the song of the river. Meanwhile, Piston sprinted toward the ridge, his boots kicking up sparks. He reached the brass relay station, a pillar of carved stone and wire, and snapped the silk thread into place. "Now, Mallow, touch the root!" Mallow hesitated. The energy in the air was thick enough to taste, bitter, like burnt cinnamon. He placed his hand on the pewter root and held the silk wire against it. The world turned white. A massive bolt of violet light descended from the sky, striking the top of the Harmony Oak. But instead of splintering the wood, the energy was swallowed. The tree acted as a giant funnel. The light poured down the trunk, through Mallow's arm, which felt like it was being filled with liquid starlight, and into the silk wire. From the wire, the energy surged into the city's relay station. The Bloom Towers didn't explode. They glowed. The excess power from the storm was being channeled into the city's batteries, turning a destructive force into a year's worth of clean, humming light. The Harmony Oak's silver bells rang out a triumphant, deafening chord. The violet clouds began to break apart, scattered by the sheer harmonic force of the tree. Mallow fell back onto the moss, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hand felt tingly, and his beard was literally glowing with static. But he was alive. Piston came running back down the slope, sliding into the glade. "It worked! The city's meters are off the charts, but the grid held. And the lilies?" Mallow looked toward the meadow. The copper lilies were no longer screaming. They were bathed in a soft, violet afterglow, their glass buds now reinforced with a permanent, iridescent tint. They had survived the storm, and in doing so, they had become stronger. "We didn't just save them, Piston," Mallow whispered, watching them. First, real stars peek through the dissipating mist. "We taught the sky how to talk to the ground without shouting." Barnaby crawled out from Mallow's pocket, his fur standing straight up from the static, looking like a tiny golden puffball. He let out a dizzy, happy buzz. The great harmony had survived its first test. The forest and the city were no longer just neighbors. They were a single, living circuit. The festival of the first light arrived when the violet residue of the storm had finally settled into a soft, permanent glow within the petals of the copper lilies. The valley was no longer divided by shadows. The lights of the bloom towers and the bioluminescence of the Ever-Sigh forest met in the middle, creating a twilight of gold and emerald that never truly faded. On the final night of the festival, gnomes from all walks of life gathered in the northern glade. There were the root keepers in their mossy robes, and the gearsmiths in their polished brass aprons. They sat, together on the grass, a sight that would have been unthinkable only a year prior. At the center of the gathering stood the Harmony Oak. Its pewter bark now shimmered with faint, pulsing ley lines of energy, the memory of the storm it had swallowed. Mallow stepped forward. He felt the weight of his years, but also a strange, new vitality. He wasn't carrying a scroll or a charcoal stick. Instead, he carried a small silver tuning fork that Piston had forged from a fragment of the anchor gear. "Friends," Mallow began, his voice carrying clearly through the still, aromatic air. "For generations, we gnomes of the archive have looked backward. We measured our lives by the rings of what had already passed. We feared the iron because it didn't have a heartbeat, and the city feared the forest because it couldn't be controlled by a lever." He reached out and tapped the Harmony Oak with the silver fork. The tree let out a low, comforting hum that settled the crowd into a deep, attentive silence. But a tree does not grow by fighting the wind. It grows by using the wind to strengthen its wood. This year, we stopped fighting the change and started grafting our futures together. We have learned that a gear can sing, and a root can conduct the light of the stars. Mallow looked at Piston, who was standing at the edge of the crowd holding a scribe device, a beautiful machine of wood and crystal that would record the vibrations of this moment. "I have been asked to leave a message for those who come after us," Mallow continued, "but I will not write it on vellum that can yellow or in ink that can fade. I will give it to the living memory of this glade." He leaned in close to the Harmony Oak. He didn't speak with his voice. He closed his eyes and projected a thought pulse, a technique he had mastered during his days of reading the whispering bark. He sent the feeling of the sapphire river, the warmth of the elderberry tea, the courage of the storm light, and the quiet joy of a shared home into the tree. As he did, the silver bell leaves of the oak began to chime in a complex, beautiful sequence. The pewter bark rippled, and new patterns appeared, symbols that weren't quite letters and weren't quite roots, but a language of pure resonance. "The message is this," Mallow said aloud, for the benefit of the crowd. "The archive is no longer a book on a shelf. The archive is the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the pulse we share. As long as we listen, the story never ends." The crowd erupted, not into cheers, but into a rhythmic clapping that mimicked the heartbeat of the forest. The bloom towers in the distance pulsed in response, sending a beam of soft amber light into the sky. Mallow sat back down on his favorite mossy rock. Barnaby buzzed a final, sleepy note and tucked himself into Mallow's beard. The old bark reader watched his apprentice, Piston, talking excitedly with a group of young gnomes about symphonic irrigation. He saw the world moving forward, no longer afraid of its own complexity. Mallow closed his eyes, listening to the Harmony Oak. He realized that he wasn't just a reader of history anymore. He was a part of the song. And for a gnome who had spent his life among the quiet of the dead wood, the music of the living was the best story he had ever heard.